All right, I'm working on a 2013 Jeep Wrangler Sahara. It's got a problem. What I believe is the radiator on it has let go. We pulled in last night with it, and pretty much all the fluid from the radiator is on the garage floor and all over the front of the motor. I know this one had a small leak in the side of the radiator, and there was a real common issue with the radiators on these that'll start to leak on the side, and then eventually the radiator will split even further, and it allows all the fluid to just come out. And at that point, it's no longer a small drip; it's a failure, right? So this failed in the driveway coming into the garage, which was kind of a fortunate, lucky place for it to fail, because we pulled it in and we parked it, and that was pretty much it. So now today I'm going to go through how to get to the radiator, and then also diagnose if it is the radiator or if it is something else potentially that's let go on the engine, whether it's the water pump or a hose or something like that. All right, first part of this is going to be taking off the engine cover, and there's these little posts underneath the cover. This cover just pops right off. You take it from the left side, you pull up on it, it'll pop out. There's a post here, and then there's a couple other posts and hooks in the back that'll pop right off. Once you get the cover off, you're gonna have to do this bolt here for the intake into the airbox area. This hose is gonna come off, these two bolts. You have a clamp on the side, left side where the airbox is, and then where the intake is, there's also another clamp on that. Pull that, loosen that up. You don't have to take that all the way off. Both the hose clamps you can just loosen. These bolts you're gonna take off all the way. And then these little clips, these plastic clips, you're gonna pull these out. What I usually do is I take a screwdriver on either side, just like that, on both sides of it, wiggle it up, and then I shoot some WD-40 in there, so you can reuse these. You can replace them if you don't wanna take them out that way, but they'll probably break. So you're gonna pull 1, 2, 3, 4, pull those right out. The ones on the grill, you don't pull those all the way out, you just loosen them. And the way those work is there is a two-piece fastener. The center is the rivet, and the holder is on the bottom still. Just pop the rivet up. You don't have to pull those out. Just pop these up. It loosens up the grill so you can slide out that plastic. That plastic is just tucked in there. It's not actually, the plastic cover for the radiator is just tucked in there. It's not actually through the hole. There's no holes through that. So that's why I say leave those in there. Just pop them up, pop the rivets up on those. And then your next step is going to be to remove the hose, and there'll be a connector underneath the hose for the mass airflow sensor, most likely. And then you're going to take the plastic cover off the radiator. So these little plastic clips would be kind of a pain. So another way you can do it is take a pair of needle nose pliers, and simply, once you get it lifted with a small pry bar or flathead screwdrivers, take your needle nose and just kind of put it under there. And as you pull up on it, it'll pop right out. Again, this is just so you can reuse these. It's just a convenience. You don't want to have to be chasing, fasteners if you don't have to be. Okay, the cover is off. All the fasteners came out really easy. This cover basically just pulls right out, and it's a slip fit with the grill, so that pulls right out. You've got it over here. Took off the intake hose, which had the mass airflow sensor connector right underneath it. So you just want to pull the clip on it. It's really easy. It's a little clip. You push it in and you pull this off. That whole assembly comes right out. You can leave it on top of the motor because you're not going to be working over there, and you can leave the plastic off to the side because you're not going to be working there either. And now you're left with basically full access to the radiator. Now at this point, it's just a straight radiator removal, which radiators are really easy. There's usually 4 bolts and a couple of hoses and maybe a couple lines that go from the transmission to the transmission cooler, which sits in front of the radiator. We'll see on this one. But again, this should be really straightforward, and I'll cover everything I'm doing. Okay, I got the fan out. Taking the fan out is really easy. You are gonna take 2 bolts off. One's gonna be here and one's gonna be over here. And then there's gonna be a clip over here, a connector. And you pull the overflow tube off of the radiator. This whole thing comes right out. So that's really like a 2-bolt one connector removal on that. And then once you do that, so I can offer some advice whenever you work on anything, right? You don't have to take things totally off the vehicle. So whenever I work on something, whether it's a water pump or it's whatever, I always try to just get everything out of the way, right? And if that means I put it right next to the area I'm working on the engine, then so be it, right? Or whether I just move it off to the side. I could have probably have done this by just taking the fan bolts off and moving the fan out more towards the engine. But since I want to make sure that I find the leak, in this case, I want to make sure I can see the bad radiator before I change anything. The other big thing when I work on things, first thing is, don't take things off all the way. Just move it out of the way so you can work on what you're trying to work on. Because when you go to put things back together, it's much easier and quicker just to pull something closer or move something a foot or two versus, oh my gosh, it's off on the ground. I have no idea how this goes. So the second big thing I always do is this is probably more important than the first tip I can offer you, is never change any parts unless you are 99% sure that part is bad. So a lot of people, what they'll do is they'll say, well, I think it's the radiator. And they would just pull this out, not test it, and replace it, and they would fill it back up again. And perhaps it's not the radiator, right? It's the water pump. The water pump seal went, and that's where you're getting all this fluid from. Or the hose ruptured on the radiator, the lower hose, the upper hose. You don't really know exactly if you're fixing the issue, if you're just changing parts and guessing. Any good mechanic will spend 99% of their time, I should say 90% of their time on a job, troubleshooting it first, and being absolutely sure that what they're about to change is going to be a 100% fix, or is at least 100% broken, and it will be one of the fixes. Maybe there's multiple things broken. So that is the rule of mechanics. Don't spend your time and waste your money just replacing parts and kind of guessing at things. Always, always, always spend 90% of your time troubleshooting and be confident that what you're changing needs to be changed. Okay. So with that said, to test the radiator, what you want to do, it's going to be empty, of course, just about, because this thing leaked. And what you want to do is pull this hose off. This is the, I think this is the supply hose, or sorry, the return hose. So the return hose is on top, and you want to pull that off, and the radiator is empty. So you can take a garden hose, and since you're going to just drop all the fluid in the radiator anyways, it's not going to get into the engine because it's not on. You don't want to add water to radiator fluid ever, but in this one case, you're just testing this. So you add water with the garden hose, fill the radiator. It'll only take a quart, 2 quarts of water. It doesn't take much. These are very small. Put this back on, right? Just hand tight. You don't have to put the clamp all the way back on. Put this back on, and then you want to create pressure in the radiator to force water out of the leak area on the radiator so that you can see where it's coming from to confirm it's actually bad. And you squeeze this. Squeeze this, pump it up like 10 times. And where you're gonna see these leak on the Wranglers 9 times out of 10 on the radiators is gonna be in the seam area here. So where this plastic meets this aluminum metal, this is just a crimp. And these crimps are famous for failing. This is where they all fail. And they all usually fail on this side because you've got a connection here. And if you think about how this is going to flex when it shrinks and expands, this is going to be pulling on it. So over the years, this crimped fitting, this crimped connection here between these two materials, the aluminum and the plastic, it's going to fail. It's destined to fail right there. And that's why these all fail. And honestly, even the Mopar factory one that you're going to buy, it's a good radiator, but it's the same design, and it's going to fail in the same spot. At some point. So my advice on this radiator, if you can get the Mopar one for about $650, I think, and maybe a little cheaper online if you want to go that route, you can get a decent OEM replacement one for about $250. They both have the same design. They both are plagued with the same failure point. So in my opinion, you're going to change this within every 5 to 10 years anyways. Go with the OEM replacement for the $250 and save yourself some money. Just my opinion on these. These fail all the time, and it's always on this side. And this one has failed on this side as well. It'll start off as a drip, and it's a small drip on the garage floor. You see the orange antifreeze, and you think it's not going to get worse, but it does. This is going to get worse, and eventually the pressure in this system, when it's hot, it causes that seam to burst. And what happens is you're going to get fluid, all the fluid in the radiator ends up on the front of the engine, and it ends up all over the place, and then you obviously are going to overheat as well. So on this one, I can show you exactly where it is. Give me a second. So the other tip I have too on a Wrangler, I have this Wrangler has a lift kit, and it has 35s on it, so it's obviously sitting a lot higher than a stock one would be. So I always have two step ladders on either side. So I've got one here and one here, and this lets me get up onto the bumper. So I use a step ladder as a way to get up here on the bumper. So that's why I'm showing you that. That's definitely a pointer. So if you want to, you can look in here. When I do this, you'll see where it's leaking. If I can get this in here enough. All right, let me try to squeeze this. A little hard to see. You'll see the drips in the bottom for sure. So you see that dripping on the bottom coming from the radiator. When I had this filled with water, you could actually see the water coming out behind this seam where the plastic and the aluminum meet. That's where you're going to see this leak slowly as a drip, and then eventually this is where it lets go completely. And if you filled this back up with water, which it takes about a quart to do that, you would see dripping. You can see dripping on the bottom there. That's coming from my, the squeezing and the leaking is dripping straight down that seam, all the way down the seam, all the way to the ground. So that's definitely a bad radiator. So 100% sure that this needs to be changed. So I'm going to go ahead and continue removing this. Okay, I got both the bolts off on the radiator, and it's easily pulled away from the front grille area. This Jeep is an automatic with AC, so there's two things to note here. You've got the AC condenser and you've got the oil cooler that are bolted to the front of the radiator assembly, and super easy to get these off. There's going to be a couple bolts on each side, but before you do that, there is one bolt on this side that you do not want to touch. So this is your line connector for the AC condenser. So if you take that off, unfortunately, all your Freon is going to leak, right? So don't touch the line set. Don't touch any of the lines going into either the AC condenser or the oil cooler for the transmission, either on the front of the radiator or behind it where the engine is, because like I said, don't take off what you don't need to take off, making your life a lot easier. If you go ahead and pull all that apart, you're going to introduce a bunch of work and potential for introducing other new issues with the transmission fluid and the Freon in the AC system, right? So again, all you're looking to do is you're looking to take the radiator out, which is already out and disconnected with these two bolts on either side. They're 10mm bolts. You pull those right out. And once you pull it out enough, I have these inserts on our Wrangler. So these inserts are aftermarket. So on a 2013, the grill would look more like this with no inserts. So you pop the inserts out, they're just little clips behind them. And then you can get to the front area where the bolts are, and you can also put your hand behind there and work on the bolts that way on either side. So I've taken these two inserts out on either side just so I could take off the mounting bolts, again, not the line bolts for the Freon connections for the hoses. And I didn't take any of the automatic transmission cooler lines off on the inside. That's all still fully connected. No reason to take any of that off. Okay, I've got everything apart. I wanted to go back and correct myself. This is not the AC condenser lines. This is the transmission oil cooler. The oil cooler sits in front of the condenser. The condenser sits closest, next to the radiator. So when you take this all apart, again, don't disturb any of those lines. You don't have to take any of the condenser lines apart. I did loosen up this one little bracket over here, which let the condenser lines float more up and down. And everything's there, right? I haven't taken anything out. It doesn't need to be moved. This is the oil cooler. It's resting against the grill, and then the condenser is resting against the grill as well. So no need to take any of that apart. There was a couple bolts. So the way this works, the condenser, the hardest part about removing this was the condenser bolts. they are tucked in behind the radiator and bolt directly to the radiator. So what that means is that the only way to get these out is you can get the left ones out real easy by removing the grills, and on either side you can get the left side bolt out. But what you're gonna find, it's a little tight in there if you just do it that way for all 4 of those bolts. What I did was I lifted the whole radiator up and I pushed it in. I swung it in towards the engine a little bit. And when you do that, just remove any wire clips that are in there that are holding it or getting in the way. And then you can sneak your hand in there and use a simple wrench on it, and you can take the 10mm bolts off the radiator that are holding this condenser, the AC condenser, to the radiator. So that was the hardest part, not a big deal. But again, you know, try to get in there from this side and put your hand down there and just get those off. Take your time with those. The 2 on the bottom are the hardest. Take your time with those 2, and you know, it was probably an extra 10 minutes just to do that, but it's not that bad. Total time to get this whole thing apart was probably 1 hour, and that's kind of, you know, just taking my time, and I've got, you know, a couple ladders in place, so I can't really get on the bumpers that easily. So about an hour. If you want to be conservative, give yourself, you know, an hour or 2 to get this all apart. And the other tip I can offer is that whenever you take things apart, always put the bolts back in place where they go on the parts, right? So I've got all my bolts where the fan bolts need to go back on. The radiator this is the old one where, you know, I'm gonna get rid of it obviously, but until I get the new part, I will leave all the bolts in place, and that way, you know, an hour or 2 from now, or a day or 2 from now when I get the new parts, I don't have to worry about where all these bolts go, because I don't think you're gonna remember exactly where they go, and you can figure it out obviously, but the way I approach it is that make it easy for yourself. And that way, when you get the new part, there's not really a lot of guesswork, and you're not introducing any new issues with the wrong bolts being in the wrong spot.